The program that we're going to be creating will take two numbers that we type in and upon hitting submit, it will fill in this graph appropriately so that it looks as though the first number is divided evenly, or where it would fall inside of this graph. And it'll adjust according to the numbers that we put in there. So the smaller number always shows up here on the left, and the larger number shows up as a part of the whole number on the right. To begin with, I'm going to create my model for this particular project. It's going to be, I'm going to call it a calculator, and my calculator object is going to take one number here and one number here and also hold a total. So I'll flip over to Eclipse and we'll get started making this calculator. Again, my object is going to be called a calculator, and with this calculator I'm going to have a number for an integer for num1 and an integer for num2, and then finally a total. I'll go ahead and create my getters and setters. And I'm going to need two constructors. I'm going to create a default no arg constructor, and I'm going to create a constructor that takes in num1 and num2 and adds those two together to set the total instance variable. For now, I'm going to leave this as my object. I do know that I'll come back in here later and I'm going to add another method to determine the percentage of the number 1 to the total. So I'll come back and do that whenever I'm ready to use that method. For now, I'm going to pop over and create a start calculator with a public static void main in order to launch my frame. First, I'll create my instance of my JFrame, and I don't have my class created yet, but I'm going to call this a calc button frame because it's going to have all my buttons on it. Go ahead and create the class real quick. There's my calc button JFrame. Finish. There we go. And this is going to extend a JFrame. I have some imports I need to add to this. But before I continue making this calc button frame, I'm going to go back to my start calculator and go ahead and finish up my JFrame or my public static void main so that I can launch it and try it out. So at this point, launch it, and I do get a window that pops up. I just don't have anything on it yet. So let's go over to our calc button frame and let's go ahead and create our constructor for it. And I have several components that I need to add, some JLabels, a text field, and a couple buttons. So I'm going to add those at this time, and you can pause this video or pick up after I get done adding all these. I want to create these components outside of my constructor and outside of my methods because I want to use them globally inside this class. And one other note is just a reminder that you'll need to import these pieces as you go through to use them. Now that I have all of my pieces added in here that I'll be using inside my constructor, I'm going to create a new JPanel and add all these components to the JPanel. After I add everything to my panel, I'm going to go ahead and add my panel to my frame. So now you can see I have all the components inside of my JFrame, but nothing's working yet. I haven't put any click listeners or done any of that at this point. So let's start with adding some click listeners, one for our submit and one for our clear. I'll do the clear one first because it will be probably the quickest and easiest part. I'm going to create an inner class. I'll call it the clear button listener, and I'm going to implement the action listener interface. Of course, I'll have to import it, and then I'll have to implement the methods. And inside of this, whenever somebody clicks on that clear button, I want to reset what's inside of the product, and the first number, the second number, and the product. I want to reset those back to empty. So I'm just going to set them to be an empty string because that's how those text fields are handled. Of course, at this time, if I went to test this, I would find that it wouldn't work, and that's because I need to add the clear button listener to the clear button. I'll create an instance of the clear button listener inside of the constructor and then attach it to the clear button. So now at this time I can test this, and if I put numbers inside of here, hit the clear button, it'll clear it out. So essentially making this just an empty string. One word of caution on this from experience is whenever you set this to an empty string inside of here, you'll want to make sure that there's no spaces here, because eventually whenever we go to parse that, there can be empty spaces, and that can throw your parsing of an int or parsing to an int off. So just a little heads up on that particular component. Alright, next let's add our submit button listener. And my submit button listener is going to grab what is inside of our first number here and grab what's inside of our second number, and then we'll create a new calculator object and we'll get the result and we'll place it in here. So let's start by grabbing what's inside of first number and second number and changing those to integers. Now that we have those two values out of the text fields, let's create a new calculator object. And if you'll recall from our constructor in our calculator class, once we pass in a number 1 and a number 2, it's automatically going to set the total for us. Now I can get what's inside of the total by using the getter for the class. That'll have the value in it, and if you'll recall from our getters that our get total returns an int value. However, in order to set the value inside of a text field, we have to change it into a string. And the easiest way to do that is just to add an empty spot to the end, and that will turn it into a string. Then we're ready to use our product.setText, and we'll set the value from the result of our getTotal method inside of that product text field. Now at this time, if I ran this again, it's not going to work because I haven't put in my submit button listener. So we're going to jump back up here to our constructor for our calc button frame and create an instance of our submit button listener and add that listener to our submit button. Now let's run our program and test it. So far so good. So now we are ready to add in the graphic component. So I'm going to create a new class for that, and I will call it the calc drawing, and that particular class is going to extend a J component because we're going to make it a graphic. When I extend a J component, I have one particular method that I need to make sure that I have in order to paint my graphic, and that is the paint component method. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in as it accepts a parameter of a graphic. A friendly reminder that the spelling and the capitalization of this method matters, so make sure that you have paint component and not paint components, and make sure that lowercase p is there at the beginning of your method. I'm going to create a rectangle here, and I'm going to start at the XY axis, and I've got to give it a height, so how tall I want my rectangle to be, and I have to give it a total length of how long I want it to be. So I'm going to create these numbers for my dimensions outside of the paint component, because at that time we can actually use those values to adjust and create another method to adjust the fill, and if we make them global, then we can use those values in both the paint component and the method that we create to adjust the fill. Again, X and Y are going to be my starting coordinates for where the beginning or the top left corner of my rectangle begins. The total length is going to be how long across my rectangle is, and then my height value will be how tall it is. Now I'm going to create a rectangle with these dimensions inside of my paint components. I can also set the color for it. So right now I have my triangle made, but I haven't added it to my calc button frame. So I'm going to jump over here back to my calc button frame, and I'm going to create an instance of my calc drawing and add that to the button frame. Now I've added it to the drawing, and just a reminder that I added it to the panel, and just a reminder, after you add it to the panel, you need to set the preferred size for the drawing. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger than I made the dimensions inside of my calc drawing class. So I'm going to go 200 width by 60 height. Again, it's a little bit taller, a little bit wider than made it inside the calc drawing, but that just gives us a little bit of some buffer room. Now I should launch this, and I will see my rectangle here appear. Again, it doesn't do anything yet, but what we want it to do is shade in this top part based on the percentage of the whole for our rectangle. So let's do to approach this, let's jump over to our down here to our click listener for our submit button, and we need to pass over to our calc drawing what we want to adjust the fill, or how much do we want to be filled up. And right now we don't have any way to pass that over to the drawing, and we don't have a method to adjust it yet inside of our calc drawing. So let's say that we're going to create one. We'll call it adjust fill, and this adjust fill is going to take in a percent. So we don't have a method yet to do that. So let's jump back, before we can finish up this method, let's jump back over to our calculator class, and we'll create a method in here that will return the double that has the percentage of the number in num1 to the whole. Now, as you'll remember, if I divide an integer by an integer, it will give me an integer. So I need a double so that I can get the exact amount. So I'm just going to cast these two to a double so that they'll be treated as doubles, and it will return a double. Then we can pop back over here to our calc button frame, and we can use that value that we get back from that method to adjust the fill. We don't have a method to adjust the fill yet, but the cool thing is Eclipse is going to try to help us. So if you click this red arrow, or the red arrow over here, it says create a method adjust fill that accepts a double in the type, and this is calc drawing. We just can't see it all here. So that's exactly what I want to do. I'm going to have Eclipse autofill this method, and it dropped me over here inside my calc drawing class, and you'll see it filled in that this is a void return type. Adjust the fills the name, accepts a double called determine percentage. So over here inside of this method, then we are ready to figure out how to get this part to shade in. And it's actually not going to be too bad. What we need to do is take the total length times the percentage that we receive, and that will give us a smaller piece of the whole. And then we can create a second rectangle to fill in that part of the whole. So let's grab, it's going to call it fill, and we'll take the total length, which is held up here inside of this 170, times the value that we get from our method, which in this case it already called it determined percentage. I would probably call it something a little bit more descriptive and maybe call it the fill amount. Now we have that value inside of a double, but if you'll look up here, our rectangles only take integers for the values. So rather than do another cast to an integer here, I'm actually going to create another variable that's going to give me the component that how far across the top this is going to fill. So the starting point is going to stay exactly the same. The height is going to stay exactly the same, but we're just going to adjust how much is filled in based on the percentage that's returned from our method. One rectangle I've got is my master rectangle here. And I'm going to create another rectangle and put it on top of it so it will look like it's shaded in. So up here, I'm going to grab my draw rectangle. My X, Y are going to stay exactly the same. My height is going to stay exactly the same. But my fill is going to adjust. So I'm going to create a variable called fill for first section. And initially, we're going to make that variable the same as the total length. This rectangle will be exactly the same size as our existing triangle until we decide to adjust the fill. And we'll set a different color. So right now I think it was orange. Yeah, it's orange. We'll set it to be yellow. And whenever I run this, just to show you, you can kind of see I've got my yellow one back behind my orange one. And right now it doesn't do anything. Let's see, but we're getting ready to adjust it so that we can see part of it. So now we don't have to change our X and our Y value, we just have to fill in, we have to change our fill for the first section. Again, our height will stay the same. So we need to cast that value that we get here for our double to our fill for our first section. We'll cast it to an int because that's how our constructor for our draw rectangle takes our values. If I try to pass in a double, I'll have an error. And then I need a very important call to a repaint method. And repaint will basically tells it, hey, after I fill these values in for my variables, come back up here and redraw my paint component. So it's one of those special methods that just reruns our paint component. So it will fill in our new values, our new numbers, and then run that again. So if I pop over here and run this now, and I take in a couple of values, you'll see, oh, I've got my rectangle here, but it's not filling. And that is because I picked draw rectangle instead of fill rectangle. So I'll make that adjustment really quick. See, it starts all yellow, and then I'll type in two numbers, hit submit. You can see it hitting submit grabbed that new value from our object. It kept the orange one back behind here, but it redrew this yellow rectangle so that it is half of the whole. Now, one thing we do still have to address is this clear button. So it works to clear out our components here, but it did not reset our image. But this will be a quick fix. So if we flip back over here to our calc button frame where we have our clear button, we can just create an empty instance of calculator using our default noarg constructor. And that will put in zeros for the value. And we can again call our adjust fill where we pass in the value of determined percentage. So this will have the value of 0 in there, and that will be adjust this to be 0. So it will essentially make it so that our yellow section begins at our coordinates 10, 10, but our fill will be 0. Our height will still be the same. So it'll look like there's nothing there. There we go. So now we've got our working calculator where it will coordinate this first triangle or rectangle to the first value here, back half to our second value to make up the whole, and we've got our clear button working as well. The code for this is inside of our Blackboard course if you'd like to take a look at it in more detail.